Clara once believed in fairy tale endings. When she married Richard, a successful businessman, she thought she had found her happily ever after. Their mansion in Lagos was a testament to their wealth, and from the outside, she had the perfect life. But behind the grand walls of their home, Clara felt like a prisoner of loneliness. Richard had long stopped showing any interest in her. His excuses were endless: work pressure, fatigue, or simply the claim that intimacy was overrated in marriage. Nights in their king-sized bed were cold, their love reduced to routine conversations about finances and social obligations. Even when she tried to rekindle the spark, Richard would brush her off, dismissing her needs as unimportant. One evening, as Clara stepped onto the back veranda, she caught sight of Daniel, their houseboy, carrying a heavy sack of rice into the storeroom. His strong arms flexed under the weight, sweat glistening on his dark skin. He was barely 23, tall and well-built, with an effortless strength that made her pause. She had never looked at him this way before. But something about the way he moved, the quiet confidence he carried, stirred something inside her, something she had not felt in years. The following morning, Clara found herself watching Daniel from the kitchen window. He was outside, shirtless, washing Richard's car. His toned back moved with every stroke of the sponge, his muscles tightening and relaxing in a way that sent an unfamiliar heat through her. She quickly turned away, ashamed of the thoughts creeping into her mind. This was wrong. Daniel was a houseboy, a much younger man, and she was a respectable married woman. But the more she tried to resist, the more her mind betrayed her. Daniel was everything Richard was not: strong, attentive, and full of energy. When he caught her staring, Daniel smiled, his deep brown eyes holding hers for a brief moment before looking away. That moment lingered in her thoughts all day, making her skin burn with anticipation. That night, as she lay beside Richard, she realized she wasn't thinking of her husband anymore. She was thinking of Daniel. The evening rain poured heavily, creating a rhythmic beat against the windows. Clara was alone in the house. Richard had gone on a business trip, and the house was eerily silent. As she walked through the dimly lit hallway, she heard a knock on the kitchen door. She opened it to find Daniel standing there, drenched from the rain, his white t-shirt clinging to his muscular frame. He had been fixing the garden lights when the storm began. "Madam, I didn't mean to disturb you," he said softly, water dripping from his short, curly hair. Clara swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. "You're soaking wet. Come inside." Daniel hesitated before stepping in. The air between them felt charged. Clara fetched a towel and handed it to him. Their fingers brushed briefly, sending a jolt through her body. "Thank you, Ma," he said, his voice deep and steady. Clara watched as he wiped himself, the towel moving across his defined arms. She knew she should leave, step away before she crossed the line. But something inside her resisted. "Daniel," she whispered, surprised at how breathless she sounded. He looked up, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite place. The distance between them felt non-existent, the rain outside a mere whisper compared to the storm brewing inside her. The next morning, Clara avoided Daniel as much as possible. She felt exposed, as though he had read the thoughts that had consumed her through the night. She reminded herself that he was just a houseboy, someone who worked for them, and nothing more. But Daniel was different now. He was aware of the shift between them. He no longer kept his head down when speaking to her. He met her gaze with an intensity that sent shivers through her. One afternoon, as she walked past the laundry area, she heard her name. "Madame Clara." She turned, heart pounding. Daniel stood there, his strong arms folded across his chest. "Yes?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. He hesitated before speaking. "I just wanted to say thank you for last night, for letting me in." She swallowed, knowing there was more meaning in those words than he intended. She should walk away. She should put an end to whatever this was before it began. But she didn't. Instead, she smiled. Richard returned that evening, oblivious to the storm building within his own home. He greeted Clara with a quick peck on the cheek, asking about business deals and household expenses before retreating to his office. The same routine, the same distance. Later that night, Clara stood by the bedroom window, watching the moonlight cast shadows across the compound. Her eyes drifted to the servant quarters where Daniel stayed. The thought of him, just a few steps away, sent a thrill through her. She forced herself to climb into bed beside Richard, but sleep did not come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel. She imagined what it would feel like to be touched, to be wanted. And she knew, deep inside, that it was only a matter of time before she crossed a line she could never return from. The following morning, Clara woke up feeling restless. She moved through the day in a daze, unable to concentrate on anything. By noon, she decided to go for a swim, hoping the water would calm her nerves. As she stepped outside in her swimsuit, she noticed Daniel sweeping the garden path. He looked up, pausing for a moment before quickly averting his gaze. Clara smirked. So, he had noticed her. She dove into the pool, the cool water easing some of the heat inside her. As she swam, she felt Daniel's eyes on her. When she finally climbed out, she grabbed her towel but made no effort to cover herself completely. She walked past him slowly, her wet skin glistening under the sun. For the first time in years, she felt desirable. And for the first time in years, she wanted more. Clara's heart pounded as she walked past Daniel, droplets of water still clinging to her skin. She felt his gaze on her back, burning through the thin fabric of her swimsuit cover-up. It was reckless, but she didn't care. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Later that evening, she found herself in the kitchen, pretending to look for something in the fridge. She knew Daniel would come in. He always did at this time to check if the cook needed help. And like clockwork, he appeared. "Madam, do you need anything?" His voice was deep, calm, but there was something else hidden beneath it. Curiosity. She turned to face him, deliberately standing too close. "No, I was just thinking." Daniel's eyes flickered with something unreadable. A challenge? A question? Before she could stop herself, her hand brushed against his. The spark was instant. A jolt shot through her body, and she saw Daniel inhale sharply, his jaw tightening. He felt it too. Clara's lips parted slightly, but before either of them could say anything, the sound of Richard's voice echoed through the hallway. She jerked away, her heart hammering in her chest. She was playing a dangerous game. Clara tried to avoid Daniel after that, but it was impossible. The tension between them was growing, an unspoken desire lingering in every glance, every accidental touch. One night, unable to sleep, she stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cool, the city lights flickering in the distance. She leaned against the railing, lost in thought, until she sensed someone behind her. She turned sharply. "Daniel," she gasped, her heart nearly stopping. "What are you doing here?" "I was just passing, Ma," he said, his voice lower than usual. But he didn't move. He didn't leave. The space between them disappeared. Clara felt her breath hitch as Daniel raised a hand and, ever so gently, brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. Goosebumps erupted on her skin. But then, a rustling noise. They both froze. Someone was watching. Clara stepped back quickly, her breath caught in her throat. Daniel tensed, scanning the darkness. The rustling had come from near the servant quarters, but the shadows made it impossible to see who had been there. "Go back," she whispered harshly. He hesitated. "Are you sure?"
"Yes. Now."
Daniel disappeared into the darkness, his footsteps silent. Clara stood frozen for a moment before rushing back inside, locking the balcony door behind her. Someone had seen them. But who? And more importantly, would they tell Richard? The next morning, Clara couldn't shake the unease curling in her stomach. At breakfast, Richard was his usual distracted self, scrolling through his phone, oblivious to her turmoil. But then something strange happened. The head maid, Florence, walked in with a cup of tea and a knowing look in her eyes. She set the tea in front of Clara and leaned in slightly. "Madam," she said softly, "some things are best left untouched." Clara's stomach dropped. She snapped her gaze to the older woman, trying to read between the lines. Did she know? Was she the one who had seen them? Florence gave a polite smile and walked away, leaving Clara gripping the edge of the table. She was being warned. Clara spent the day on edge, watching everyone closely. Every time Florence passed by, her stomach twisted with paranoia. But Florence wasn't the only one acting strange. Daniel was avoiding her. That evening, she found him near the back entrance, chopping firewood for the kitchen. "Why are you avoiding me?" she demanded. "I'm not, Ma," he replied, keeping his eyes on the wood. "Don't lie to me," she whispered, stepping closer. "What happened last night? Someone saw us, didn't they?" Daniel paused, then slowly met her gaze. His expression was unreadable, but his next words sent a chill down her spine.
Yes.
"And I think they're going to tell your husband." Clara barely slept that night. Every sound made her jump. Every movement outside made her wonder. Was this the moment Richard found out? By morning, she could barely function. Then, a knock on her bedroom door. "Florence." Clara's heart nearly stopped. The older woman entered, closing the door behind her. "I don't mean to meddle, madam," she began, voice eerily calm. "But I know what you've been doing with Daniel." Clara swallowed, her hands turning clammy. Florence took a step closer. "I don't plan to tell Master. But loyalty comes at a price." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She was being blackmailed. Florence's expression was unreadable, but her words were clear. "I want 500,000 naira, she said, her voice quiet yet firm. "In cash. Or I tell Richard." Clara felt a wave of dizziness. This was worse than she imagined. If Richard found out, she could lose everything. She tried to act composed. "And if I refuse?" Florence gave a knowing smile. "Then I'll let him know exactly why his wife spends so much time looking out the kitchen window." Clara had no choice. But she also knew something Florence didn't. She wasn't going down alone. Clara didn't become the woman she was by being weak. If Florence thought she could blackmail her, she was mistaken. That evening, she made her move. She called Florence into the study, setting a small tape recorder on the table. "I'm happy to pay you," she said smoothly, leaning forward. "But first, I need you to repeat exactly what you said earlier." Florence's eyes flickered with hesitation. Clara smiled. "You see, my dear Florence, if I go down, so do you. You've been working for us for years, and I know things about you, too." A tense silence filled the room. Florence swallowed. "Are you threatening me?" Clara leaned in closer, her voice deadly calm. "Consider it insurance." Clara's heart raced as she stared Florence down. She had just turned the tables, but she knew this wasn't over. The older woman was calculating, and something in her eyes said she wouldn't back down so easily. Florence gave a slow smile. "You're smarter than I thought, madam." Clara smirked, masking her unease. "I don't take threats lightly." But as Florence walked away, Clara knew she had made a dangerous enemy. The woman had worked in their household for years. She knew Richard's habits, his business connections, and worst of all, she had patience. Clara had won the first round, but the war was far from over. That night, she found herself craving release. Power. And there was only one place to get it. Daniel. The moonlight bathed the backyard in a silver glow. Clara's heart pounded as she slipped silently out of the house. She had texted Daniel earlier, a simple message. "Come to the pool house. Now." She reached the small building behind the mansion, her pulse hammering with anticipation. Moments later, Daniel entered. "Madam, this is dangerous," he murmured, his deep voice filled with concern. "I don't care." Clara stepped forward, pressing a hand to his chest. She felt his heartbeat, strong and steady, and it thrilled her. Daniel hesitated for only a second before his hands slid around her waist, pulling her close. Their lips met, hungry, desperate, forbidden. In that moment, she felt alive. Little did she know Florence was watching. Florence wasn't just watching, she was recording. Hidden in the shadows, she smirked as she captured video evidence of Clara and Daniel tangled in passion. She didn't need money anymore. She needed revenge. The next morning, Clara noticed Florence's change in demeanor. The older woman moved with eerie confidence, her smirk barely concealed as she served breakfast. "Tea, madam?" she asked sweetly. Clara's skin prickled. She was losing control. And worse, she had no idea what Florence would do next. The first blow came subtly. That afternoon, Richard called Clara into his office. He was frowning, his phone in his hand. "I heard something strange today," he said, his voice measured. Clara's breath caught. "What do you mean?" He looked at her sharply. "Some of the workers have been whispering. They said you spend a lot of time with Daniel." Her stomach twisted. "Florence." She forced a laugh. "Richard, that's ridiculous. He works here." "Of course. I see him often." Richard studied her, then nodded. "I thought so. But tell me, Clara," his voice dropped. "Why does Florence seem to think otherwise?" Her heart stopped. That night, Clara stormed into the kitchen, where Florence was chopping vegetables. "What the hell are you doing?" Clara hissed. Florence didn't look up. "I just like to keep things interesting." Clara gritted her teeth. "You already lost. I turned your blackmail against you." Florence smirked.
Did you?
"The thing is, madam, I don't need money anymore." Clara narrowed her eyes. "What do you want?" Florence finally met her gaze, her expression chillingly calm. "I want to watch you fall." Clara knew she should stop. The risks were too high. But the more she was pushed into a corner, the more she craved Daniel. The next evening, she sent Richard on an errand, something about a meeting that didn't exist. The moment he was gone, she pulled Daniel into her bedroom. There was no hesitation this time. Only hunger. "Tell me you want this," she whispered. Daniel's grip tightened on her waist. "I want you." Their lips met in a fiery collision. And this time, they didn't notice the blinking red light from the hidden camera. Florence had proof. She transferred the footage onto a flash drive, watching the screen with satisfaction. Clara had dug her own grave. Now all that was left was to deliver the final blow. The next morning, she made a call. "Sir, there's something you should see. Your wife has a secret." Richard's voice was calm, but she could hear the danger beneath it. "Send it to me." Florence smiled. The war had begun. Clara woke up feeling uneasy, unaware that her fate had already been sealed. Richard was unusually quiet at breakfast, barely touching his food. He glanced at her with an expression she couldn't read. She tried to act normal. "You're not eating much." Richard gave a tight smile. "Not hungry." She ignored the chill creeping up her spine. Meanwhile, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. She opened it. A video attachment. The moment she clicked it, her blood turned to ice. It was her. With Daniel. Clara's hands shook as she reread the message. "Does your husband know?" Her pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't just a warning. This was a threat. She looked across the table at Richard, who was scrolling through his phone. He seemed calm.
Too calm.
Did he already know? Her world was unraveling, and she had no idea how bad it was about to get. Clara barely touched her breakfast. Her mind raced with panic, trying to figure out who had sent her the video. It had to be Florence. She knew she couldn't let Richard see it. But was it too late? His silence, his eerie calmness, it made her uneasy. Was he pretending?
Her phone buzzed again.
"Delete it all you want, Clara. But this isn't the only copy." Her stomach twisted. Richard finally spoke. "You seem distracted." She forced a smile. "Just tired." He nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "Rest then. You'll need your strength." The way he said it sent chills through her. Over the next few days, Richard's behavior changed. Instead of being distant, he became attentive. He started buying Clara expensive gifts, taking her out for dinners, showering her with affection. Clara felt uneasy. Was he guilty for neglecting her? Or was he playing a game? One night, he surprised her with a romantic getaway. "Just the two of us," he whispered against her neck. "Let's reconnect." Her pulse hammered. Was this love? Or a death sentence? Richard took her to an exclusive beach resort. Their suite overlooked the ocean, and everything felt too perfect. That night, they had dinner under the stars. He poured her a glass of wine. Clara hesitated. Had he laced it with something? She drank anyway, smiling through her fear. I love you, Clara, Richard said softly. Her stomach churned. Before she could respond, he leaned closer. I need to show you something. Her heartbeat stopped. He took out his phone, unlocked it, and turned the screen toward her. It was the video of her and Daniel. Clara froze. The world around her disappeared. The sound of the waves, the distant laughter of other guests, it all faded into nothing. Richard's gaze was unreadable. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't cursing. He was smiling. How long? He asked calmly. Clara's mouth opened, but no words came out. Richard leaned back in his chair. You don't have to answer. I already know. She wanted to run. But where? And worse, why wasn't he angry? Richard poured himself another drink. You thought I wouldn't find out, didn't you? Clara swallowed hard. Richard, Save it. He took a sip, his expression too controlled. I should be furious. I should destroy you. But he tilted his head, studying her. That would be too easy. Clara's breath hitched. You see, my darling wife, I don't want revenge. Not yet. He leaned in, his voice chilling. I want you to suffer. Richard took out another phone. He pressed play. Clara's blood ran cold. On the screen were multiple clips of her and Daniel from different angles. There were cameras. Cameras in their bedroom. Cameras in the guest house. Everywhere. Richard had been watching. Recording. And now he had all the evidence he needed. Richard took a deep breath, pretending to be relaxed. This is how it's going to go, Clara. She gripped the table, her hands shaking. You're going to continue being my wife, he said. You will smile. You will act like nothing is wrong. Clara's chest tightened.
Why?
Richard's grin turned cruel. Because the moment you try to leave, the moment you fight back. He pulled out his phone and scrolled. He showed her a new video. Daniel.
Bound. Beaten.
Bloody. Clara's heart stopped. You see, Clara, Richard said, sipping his drink. You weren't the only one I set a trap for. Tears burned behind Clara's eyes. What did you do to him? Richard smirked. Oh, nothing much. Just made sure he knows his place. He slid a divorce agreement across the table. Sign this, he said, and I'll let him live. Clara's hands trembled. If she signed, she would lose everything. If she refused, Daniel might not survive the night. Clara looked down at the papers. Her name was printed neatly at the bottom, waiting for her signature. Richard tapped the pen against the table. Tick-tock, darling. Her mind raced. If she signed, she'd be humiliated. She'd lose her home, her status, everything. But if she didn't, her pulse pounded as she picked up the pen. She hesitated. Then an idea struck her. One last chance. One last fight. She wouldn't go down without a war. Clara's hand trembled over the divorce papers. Richard was watching, waiting. He thought he had won. He thought she would break. But Clara wasn't a woman who accepted defeat. She lifted the pen and dropped it. I'm not signing, she said. Richard's smile faded. Excuse me? She straightened her spine, forcing calm into her voice. If I sign, you'll still ruin me. You'll still make sure everyone knows. So why should I play your game? His eyes darkened. Then Daniel dies. Clara's heart squeezed. But she knew something Richard didn't. Daniel was already gone. The night before, Daniel had been bound and beaten in a dark basement Richard controlled. The men holding him, Richard's enforcers, had been given strict orders. Break him. Make sure he knows his place. Daniel was battered, bleeding, but he wasn't broken. That night, as the guards drank, laughing about what they'd do to him next, Daniel waited for his moment. When one of them loosened his ropes to reposition him, he struck. A brutal headbutt. A sharp kick. He snatched the knife from the nearest guard and slit his binds the rest of the way. He didn't stop to think. He ran. And now he was free. And he was coming for revenge. Richard didn't know yet. He still thought Daniel was his prisoner. Clara kept her face neutral, hiding the thrill of knowing her lover was out there, somewhere. Richard slammed his hand on the table.
Fine.
You don't want to sign? I'll ruin you anyway. Clara met his gaze. Try me. Richard's lips curled into a snarl. Oh, you have no idea what's coming, darling. She didn't flinch, but she should have, because Richard wasn't bluffing. The next morning, Clara woke up to her name trending. Her phone was blowing up. Her heart dropped as she clicked on the video link. It was her. Her and Daniel, naked, tangled, caught in the act. The footage had been leaked online. Every social media platform was flooded with her humiliation. Her name was ruined, and Richard had done it. Within hours, Clara's world collapsed. Her family called, disowning her. Her friends?
Gone.
Her reputation? Destroyed. She turned on the TV. A news anchor was discussing this scandal of the year. Even Richard's business partners were mocking her. She clenched her fists. He wanted to break her. But instead, he had created a monster. Clara spent 3 days in darkness, alone in her room. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She plotted. Richard thought she was done. He thought she had no fight left. He was dead wrong. She would destroy him. She would ruin his name. And she would do it the way he least expected. Clara needed power. And she knew exactly where to find it. That night, she made a call. Hello, Madam Clara. A deep voice answered. I was wondering when you'd reach out. It was Chief Balogun, a notorious political kingmaker. A man even Richard feared. I need your help, Clara said, her voice smooth but deadly. The chief chuckled. I take it this is about your dear husband? Clara smirked. You have no idea. Richard arrived at his office the next morning to chaos. His company was under investigation. His bank accounts? Frozen. The government had launched a full corruption probe. Richard's blood ran cold. And then his phone rang. Clara. He answered. Her voice was sweet as poison. Did you really think I'd go down without a fight, darling? Richard's grip on the phone tightened. What the hell did you do? Clara laughed softly. This is just the beginning. Meanwhile, Daniel had vanished. Richard had his men searching for him, but no one could find him. Until one night, Richard stepped into his office and found Daniel sitting in his chair. His face was still bruised. His knuckles were still raw. But his eyes burned with fury. Richard's heart pounded. How did you? Daniel stood. You think you can take everything from me? Richard reached for the gun in his drawer. But Daniel was faster. He slammed Richard's hand down, sending the gun flying. Richard tried to fight, but Daniel was younger, stronger, angrier. Within seconds, Richard was on the floor, gasping for breath. Daniel leaned down, whispering four chilling words. I'm not done yet. Clara and Daniel were finally on the same page. She wanted revenge. He wanted justice. And now, they had Chief Balogun's power behind them. The plan was simple. 1. Strip Richard of his wealth. 2. Expose his darkest secrets. 3. Leave him with nothing. But Richard wasn't going down alone. And Florence was still in the shadows, waiting for her chance. Richard sat in his now empty mansion, a broken man. His accounts had been frozen, his business empire crumbling overnight. Everything he had built gone. His political allies had abandoned him. His name was a stain in the media. But he wasn't finished yet. Clara thought she had won. Daniel thought he had escaped. But Richard still had one card left to play. And he was going to burn everything down with him. That night, Clara and Daniel met at a private suite in a high-end hotel. They toasted to their victory, their smiles laced with danger. We finally buried him, Daniel murmured, swirling his drink. Clara smirked. Not just buried, destroyed. But at that exact moment, a black SUV pulled up outside the hotel. Inside were 4 men, dressed in black, carrying silenced weapons. Richard had made one final call, and he had hired killers. Clara leaned into Daniel, whispering in his ear when glass shattered. Gunshots ripped through the air, tearing into the walls. Daniel grabbed Clara and pulled her to the ground. Move, he shouted. They scrambled toward the emergency exit as bullets rained down. The assassins chased them, determined to end it. But Daniel was faster. He shoved open a side door, dragging Clara into the dark alley. They ran, hearts pounding. Richard sent them. Clara gasped, pressing a hand to her racing chest. Daniel's eyes hardened. Then we finish this. For good. Clara and Daniel had barely escaped with their lives. But Florence wasn't done. She had stayed silent, waiting, watching. And just when Clara thought she had dealt with all threats, Florence made her move. The next morning, Clara received an urgent message. It was from Chief Balogun. We have a problem. Come now. Clara arrived at Balogun's estate, only to find Florence standing there, waiting. Next to her, a group of police officers. Clara's stomach dropped. What is this? She asked. Florence smiled. Justice, dear madam. One of the officers stepped forward, holding handcuffs. Clara Williams, you are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Clara's blood ran cold. Florence had framed her. Handcuffs clicked around Clara's wrists. She had been outplayed. Florence leaned in, whispering with a smirk. You thought you could beat me? I've been playing this game longer than you. Clara thrashed, screamed, but it was too late. The police dragged her away. The headlines exploded. Clara Williams, mistress and scandal queen, finally caught. The world laughed at her downfall. And Richard?
He was still out there.
Clara had lost everything. Her freedom, her power, her name. She sat in a dark jail cell, rage burning inside her. Florence thought this was the end. Richard thought he had won. They were wrong. Because Clara wasn't done yet. And when she got out, she would make them all pay. Daniel hadn't been caught. He was still free. And he wasn't leaving Clara behind. He tracked down Florence, watching her from a distance. She was celebrating, sipping wine, acting like she had won. Daniel's jaw clenched. She had no idea what was coming. Florence woke up to a gun pressed against her head. Daniel stood over her, his eyes cold. Enjoying your victory, he murmured. Florence's body shook. Please. Daniel smirked. You don't deserve to live. A single shot rang out. Florence was no more. With Florence gone, Daniel turned his focus to Clara. She was still in prison, but not for long. He hacked into the prison security, waiting for the right moment. And when the power suddenly went out, the breakout began. The moment Clara stepped out of the prison gates, she was reborn. She had been humiliated.
Betrayed.
But she was still standing. And she was about to destroy Richard. For good. Clara and Daniel arrived at Richard's new hideout. He had gone underground, hiding in a safe house. But he wasn't safe anymore. Clara kicked the door open. Richard's eyes widened. You. She pulled the trigger. The reign of Richard was over. The world thought Clara was finished. But they were wrong. She had money hidden away. She had Daniel by her side. And she was smarter than ever. Clara Williams was back. And this time, no one could take her down. They whispered about her in elite circles. The woman who had fallen and risen again. The woman who had survived betrayal, destruction, and scandal. Some feared her. Some worshipped her. But one thing was certain. Clara Williams was untouchable. Clara Williams was no longer the woman she once was. She had been a wife, a mistress, a prisoner. Now she was a queen. After Richard's death, she and Daniel disappeared from the public eye. No one knew where they had gone, but whispers floated through elite circles. She controlled things from the shadows now. Deals were made in silence. Political figures owed her favors. Businesses that once laughed at her now bowed before her. She had won. But in the world of power, no one stays on top forever. And Clara's greatest enemy was about to emerge from right beside her. Clara trusted only one person, Daniel. He had saved her. He had killed for her. But Daniel was not the same man anymore. Power changed people. And now he wanted more. One night, as they dined in their secluded estate, Daniel poured Clara a glass of wine. You've built an empire, he said, swirling his drink. But don't you ever wonder if it's time for someone else to lead? Clara's gaze darkened. What are you saying, Daniel? He leaned in, his smile sharp. I think you've had your turn. Her stomach twisted. He was challenging her. Clara had always known this day would come. Daniel had been hungry for power since the beginning.
And now?
He was coming for her throne. She didn't wait for him to make the first move. She struck first. That night, as Daniel slept, a single gunshot rang through the estate. When the guards ran in, they found Clara standing over Daniel's body, her face unreadable. She had loved him, but love had no place in her world anymore. Clara Williams was alone again, but that was how it had to be. She stood by the window of her penthouse, looking down at the city she now owned. Everything she had fought for, she had won. She had destroyed her enemies. She had survived scandal, betrayal, and war.
And now?
She was untouchable. No love, no weakness, only power. As she sipped her wine, her phone buzzed. A message. We have a new problem, madam. A new enemy is rising. Clara smirked. Let them come. In the end, Clara doesn't just survive. She rises, leaving Richard in the wake of his own destruction. The game is over for Richard, but for Clara, this is just the beginning of her reign. The story ends with the powerful realization that sometimes the greatest power lies in resilience, and the worst enemy is the one who underestimates you. Let us know what you think about this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. Thanks for watching.